So as Monaco said, I'm Corey Butler, and I do live here in Austin. So it's great to see everybody here gathering around Node, in my own hometown. Author.io is, as he said, brand new. The under construction page was just launched like yesterday. So this is really new, but this talk is kind of inspired by the journey that led to that, as well as several of the open source projects that have really been around. So really, we're going to be trying to condense 2 years into about 20 minutes worth of talk. So this is going to go fairly fast. If you have questions or want to talk in detail about anything, I will be around the conference. Just stop me and ask. So developing Nirvana. Nirvana is defined as a transcendent state in which there is neither suffering, desire, nor a sense of self, and the subject is released from the effects of karma and the cycle of death and rebirth. It represents the final goal of Buddhism. Now, this isn't a religious talk, right? It's, the key points here are that it's talking about really disregarding suffering, desire, sense of self, and to me, that's really a state of contentment, and that's something that we're looking for in our workflows. And then it's also a goal. It's not something that's here right now. It's something that we're pursuing. So I like to think of developing Nirvana as pursuing a state of contentment. Now, in order to do that, we have to ask, what is contentment? What's it composed of? And there's really two major factors. The amount of time that you spend working on stuff, so the amount of time you're spending coding, the amount of time you're thinking about the code, planning processes, then there's the stress factors. Now, time is really kind of the currency of life. And so how we spend it and where we spend it is important to everybody. This is a unifying factor beyond just developers and managers and business folks. So it's something we can all relate to. Stress, on the other hand, it directly impacts how we experience that time. So as a developer, if you are working on something that's stressing you out, obviously that's not something that you want to be doing. And as you would expect here, high time spent, high stress is low contentment, whereas low time spent and low time stress is much higher contentment. The big question is, how do we get to that point in our development workflow? The answer to this is really that we don't, because again, this is a journey, and there are many things we can do on our development journey, though, that will make our lives a lot more enjoyable. And so really answering the question of how can you be a happier developer really begins with your understanding of these motivators. And people have a lot of difficulty actually asking themselves the questions surrounding these points. So I have a little trick. I call it find the fulcrum. Really, your time and your stress and your own objectives when you're working are competing forces, and they're offset by the work that you actually do, so your actual effort. And these are not always equal forces. So like in this stick figure diagram, you can see that the load arm here is a lot shorter than the effort arm. So the key is finding a point that's going to give you the greatest leverage for the work that you put into things. And that's kind of the ethos that I've followed over the last couple of years. And once you know where your fulcrum is, you're able to start asking the questions that make you a better developer, make you a happier developer. Now for me, this begins with developer workflow. I've been a consultant most of my career, and so I've spent a lot of time thinking about workflow. The reason that I keep coming back to this term is because it's really the path of least resistance to change. This is both at an individual level or at an enterprise level. It's really the key piece that we can control as an individual. So even if you don't have much say in the overall architecture of of the applications that you work on, maybe it's a large system, you can still control your own individual workflow. Workflow is also something that touches all parts of the development lifecycle, including the human side. And so the question that I kept asking myself over and over is, why don't more people actually pay attention to this? And I think it's really that we get to a point where you hear the term workflow and it's really forgotten. It's just something that's not really, it's just kind of there. You don't really think about it too much until you listen to a talk like this or talking with colleagues. We're also, people are creatures of habit, and habits often prevent us from asking more questions or questioning things that we may already deem to be true. And finally, people think developers are smart, right? And frankly, developers think that developers are smart. And that's great, but the term smart is really kind of abused, and it's become a more all-encompassing definition that a lot of people really think of as does anything and everything. So, I mean, when you think about what you're doing at work, how many different things do you have on your plate at any given time? And balancing that load can be quite challenging. And what this really does is it surfaces a problem that's in almost all of IT, and that's that empathy is really lacking. Really, people don't understand what we do as developers. Sometimes we don't even understand what we do as developers. I mean, think about all the new technology that's out there. And so IT isn't really known for understanding emotions. Yet we all experience them. It's something, again, that we all have in common. And the biggest emotion that I feel as a developer is oftentimes that we can be pretty overwhelmed. And so I look to areas like wine. Now, I don't know if any of you are familiar with wine, but winemaking has really been around for centuries, maybe even millennia, I don't remember. But it's interesting because there are a lot of parallels to development. Like wine changes through its entire life cycle based on the environment, based on the temperatures, based on people's taste. So if you and I are sharing the same glass of wine, but in different glasses, if you swirl it around, the chemical makeup of the wine is going to change. And that's going to be different in your glass than in mine. So we may have a completely different taste, and it might be subtle, but it is different, even though we're drinking the same wine. And that's very similar to things like node modules or to frameworks that you may be using. So my tip is to think about targeting continual change. And this is really the opposite of thinking about, a lot of people when they think about workflow, they just want to make their lives easy. They want an easy development workflow. And I think that this is really in the eye of the beholder, because what you may think of as easy may seem really verbose to someone else. So again, it's a changing environment, and so if you focus on change as your common denominator, you can get a lot further with your code. And so that's where I learned this mostly in creating NVM for Windows. Now, for anybody that's unfamiliar, it's a version manager. As was mentioned in one of the keynotes, there's a working group around this now because it's become a rather hot subject. But at the end of the day, it's version management for Node. And what I recognized when I created this was that the environment was constantly changing. So this came out first, right around the Node 0.11 branch. And then we saw the introduction of IOJS, then we saw the merger of IOJS. Then there were naming changes. We saw the unstable and stable versions moving into LTS and current. And now we're looking at things going forward, being able to swap out the engine, right? You can throw in Chakra instead of V8. So that was really the genesis behind NVM for Windows, was that I knew that the environment was always going to change, and how do I handle that? And like with any version manager, there's an expectation that you are going to save time. Nobody wants to install and then uninstall and reinstall different versions just in order to test them. And this is really this utility is what gave NVM for Windows use and value. And it's why people keep using it today, but it's not really what made it popular. So the question of what makes something popular, and NVM for Windows has become popular. It's the most starred node version manager for Windows. There have been a whole lot of downloads in the last couple of months, and I think that these numbers are frankly a little bit small because there's more deployment of this internally in organizations than there is externally. And there's a fair number of contributors. In fact, after this conference, we're going to be doing translations into several different languages. And the contributors are coming from all over the globe. And I think that that's really unique because when you think about the popularity of a project or getting people behind a project that you're working on, you're asking questions about like what is the motivator. And that last point about contributors being across the globe is what solidified this for me, because this is written in Go. This has nothing to do with Node. There's not a lick of JavaScript in this application. But there are contributors that are so passionate about Node that they are willing to go and learn at least a little bit of Go to help contribute to this. And so I asked myself, why would anybody do that? I mean, who's as crazy as I am to sit down and learn another language, to manage another language? It really boiled down to the stresses again. When I created this application, this was probably the darkest time of my life. I had more stresses than I could possibly imagine. I actually wrote this from primarily doctor's office lobbies. My life was kind of in turmoil, and at the time I was also teaching a lot of people about Node. And the big challenge was that Node was moving so fast that it was hard to keep up with things. The popular factor came into just an installer. Just being able to get this installed, because NVM for Windows was not the first version manager for Windows. There were several before, but it was the first one to come with an installer. And so that dropped people's stress. That dropped my stress. And so developers would respond to me saying that they felt good using this tool. And I thought, well, it's just an installer. But getting to the point where you can actually use your code is as important as the code itself and what it's doing for you. So my tip in this is to just ask yourself about your own stresses. This may sound kind of stupid, but at the end of the day, the little nitpicky things are really what gnaw at you. And who really wants to be working day to day with a workflow that gnaws at you? Sometimes that's more challenging than some of the big stresses that we have in our lives. And that also moves into what makes people actually use a technology. And I think this is unequivocally trust. It doesn't mean that you're going to be using the best technology out there. It just means that you're going to be using a technology that you believe in. This is kind of where Node, in my mind, came from. So if any of you have read any of Ryan Dahl's blogs, he's got one out there talking about how he hates just about all software. It's kind of a distrust in software, and that is what brought a lot of the concepts that are now Node around in the first place. So my trick here for this is to piggyback off of things that people do trust. And the example here would be the Node Windows, Node Mac, and Node Linux series. This was a series, or it's 3 separate projects that I created a number of years ago now at this point. I piggybacked off of the trust in the operating system. Now, you may be a Mac user or a Windows user, but maybe you're not both. You may not, or you know that the Mac operating system and the Windows operating system are solid, and they're going to be able to do the things that you would expect to be able to do, but you might not know how to accomplish everything. So in this case, these projects, you're able to set up background daemons or background services to run native Node scripts. So you just run a script and it will run as though it's a native process on any one of these operating systems using the same consistent API. So again, it's a blending of trusting. This project will take the trust that you may have in an operating system and combine it with the trust that you have in your own ability to code in Node. And it alleviates the problem of having to understand how the intricacies of each one of these operating systems works. And there was a third motivator in this too, to just kind of emphasize the point of popularity again. The Node Windows project is, even though they're all basically the same, it's far and away the most popular of these. And it took yet another stress off of developers, primarily by the fact that there are no native dependencies in this one. And that was especially critical at the time because in order to run a background process on Windows, if you did have to use native dependencies, you're talking about a 10 gigabyte download with Visual Studio. There were a lot of challenges between the versions at that time. So without any native dependencies, that wasn't a problem. So again, the more the stress decreases, the more popular a project can become, so long as you know what stresses those are you're dealing with. So modern developer experiences today. Again, this is really the last couple of months that I've been working on a couple of different libraries, as well as a tool called Fenix, which I released a couple of years ago. It really is what I attribute my more recent work, the success of that and how quickly I was able to get things done, I attribute to Fenix. So I'm going to take a quick look. There are 2 libraries that I've been working on. NGN is it's kind of the building blocks for your own framework, both back end and front end. Chassis, on the other hand, which was actually created by my brother, is a layout engine based on responsive topography, which is just an ethos that we like to follow. Now, NGN has a whole bunch of stuff going on with it. There's data modeling, there are microservice architectures, there's a whole bridging platform. It works with Docker. There are native Docker containers out there that you can use. Chassis has a web component library. It has its own front-end utilities. There's a lot of stuff in this. And it was two guys working part-time that got this done in less than 9 months, something that a lot of teams can't do in years. And the reason behind this is a really, really simple tool. Fenix is a visual static web server for Windows and Mac. And it ships, the unique thing compared to other static web servers is that this ships with a sharing system. So it's point and click. You fire up a website on your local machine, pointing to a directory that contains your HTML files or JavaScript or whatever. You click a button, share it, you get a link, and you can now immediately collaborate with people. So you're serving from your local machine directly to the web, and then you shut it down when you're done. So what this gave us was instant infrastructure and instant sharing. It gave us faster feedback loops, and it was a lot more intuitive for people that weren't just back-end developers. So we brought our time and stress down again, and we really gave ourselves a platform that we could trust for productivity. Now the result of all of this was that we had a shift in time. We stopped focusing so much on local infrastructure and administration. So things like maybe needing to run an Nginx server and reconfiguring it to test something. We didn't have to do that. We didn't have the administration of having to launch up a new Google Hangout or some other way to collaborate across country, which was our case. So our time shifted away from that into doing things that were more relevant to the libraries that we were working on, so things like unit testing and documentation. And as a result, we wound up with nearly 800 unit tests for NGN, and the project hasn't even really been formally released. So ultimately, this gave us more useful code, more robust code, fewer bugs, shorter developer onboarding time, and the code was really just easier to understand because we had the time to focus on it. So the future for us is kind of a little bit more of the same. Fenix Web Server 3, the screenshot is a little bit small, but it focuses on new challenges that we experience. Things like being able to toggle on and off SSL, being able to test core support or gzip compression. Does that actually matter in your application or not? It just brings up more questions, and that's a good thing. You know, a lot of times you think that if you are working on an application, you just want it done. You don't want to be asking more questions, and I think the exact opposite. You really should be asking as many questions as you can. So kind of keeping with our Austin theme, I'd like to leave you with the idea of continue to ask questions about your own workflow. It's not, being able to ask questions about things that you may consider to be norms is not a bad thing. So get out there and just keep thinking about what you're doing every day and ask yourself how you can make your own life better and what's really motivating you. And that's really all I've got here today, so thank you for your time.
You have 1 minute.
Yeah, we have a minute, so are there any questions? Yeah.
I can talk loudly. You said you support Windows and Mac. Is it based on Electron or something, or is everything?
The original version is based on Node WebKit. It's a pretty old version, but the new version is based on Electron. I've been able to run it on Linux, but I'm not planning to support Linux just due to the sheer number of intricacies that it would frankly take too much time for two guys. Yeah, the question was around Fenix and the fact I'd mentioned that it's supported on Windows and Mac, and the question was about whether or not that was built on Electron. And the answer was the original version was based on Node WebKit. The new version is based on Electron.
8 seconds. So I think we can take it offline if anyone
All
has
right.
questions. Thank you so much, Corey. Round of applause for Corey, please.